Images circulated on Thursday of a blockade of cars and protesters preventing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from leaving for an overseas trip. So much so that he ended up having to take a helicopter to get to the airport. This was part of a nationwide day of resistance that protesters planned against Netanyahu, against his government, against their planned judicial overhauls that, if implemented, would further get rid of any checks and balance systems in Israel. But this day was actually just one of many days. It wasn't unique. One of many days, many protests that have been happening in Israel since January. In places like Tel Aviv, hundreds of thousands gather every Motzei Shabbat, every Saturday night. More surprising if you look at places like off the beaten path in Afula, where hundreds are gathering for these protests. There was an article last week that even reservists in the IDF said that they would refuse a call-up order as a form of protest. And at these protests, you see former left-wing or centrist political leaders, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, current opposition leader Yair Lapid, you see former Justice Minister Tzipi Livni, but there's nothing really about a political divide. That's not what these protests are about. And these protests aren't anarchists, as some in the Netanyahu government would suggest. And these protesters aren't anti-Zionists, as some suggest any criticism of the Israeli government is there or here. In fact, these protesters protest as proud Zionists, waving that blue and white flag. They protest as proud Jews with a Magen David at the center of that flag, refusing to accept changes that the government is trying to implement that they see as antithetical to the words of Israel's Declaration of Independence that David Ben-Gurion recited almost 75 years ago. For on May 14th, 1948, he read out loud proudly that the state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of exiles, that it will foster the development of the country for the benefits of all its inhabitants, that it will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, of race, of sex. We also know that as we see these protests happening, the same day this day of resistance was taking place to protest Netanyahu's government, we saw the latest pogua, the latest terrorist attack, as a Hamas terrorist opened fire in a cafe on Dizengoff Street in the heart of Tel Aviv, shooting 3 young men on their way to a wedding. One of many violent terrorist attacks against innocent Israeli citizens in recent weeks that are often then responded by a military action in the West Bank, or the worst of what we saw a week ago when settlers became terrorists themselves in Huwara. Thomas Friedman wrote in the New York Times this week, referencing the challenge of an American rabbi to speak about Israel, about a leader of the American Jewish community to give an opinion about what's going on in Israel at all, referencing an article, The Jewish Press. He cited Rabbi Sharon Brous of Ikar in Los Angeles, who referred to a sermon about Israel as death by sermon. That you speak about Israel and there's somebody sitting who's going to disagree with you no matter what. Rabbi Angela Buckdahl of Central Synagogue said when she chose to speak about these protests against Netanyahu, she prefaced her sermon by saying that she was up all night, worried about upsetting her congregation or congregants, worried how they would respond to her words of Torah. And part of the problem is that when we speak of Israel, we can't only speak words of criticism. We can't only say, I'm going to give a sermon to criticize Netanyahu's government. We can't only say, I'm going to give a sermon and talk about occupation, or I'm going to give a sermon and talk about judicial reforms that are happening. Because that's also not what our relationship with Israel is supposed to be about. But if we don't acknowledge the hundreds of thousands that are protesting weekly, if not daily, in Israel, then we're also tone deaf. Worse yet, what these rabbis talked about was not talking about Israel at all. And thus, Israel no longer being a central part of who we are as a Jewish people, who we are as Jews, because we're fear disagreement when we should see any disagreement truly as a machloket l'shem shamayim, as a holy disagreement because of our shared love of Israel. So we have to talk about it, talk about Israel's beauty, and talk about the challenges that are going on in the state right now. As the Shalom Hartman Institute wrote last week, we must talk about Israel because we insist that the core moral and political aspirations of the state, that it be both a homeland for the Jewish people and a vibrant democracy, a homeland for Jews and Palestinians, and a Jewish state and a state for all its citizens, are not competing ideas in tension with one another, and certainly not contradictions. Rather, they are complex, yet plausible aspirations for the state of Israel that can be honored through a serious commitment to Jewish and democratic values. This means loving Israel. This means being critical of the Israeli government. This means we can't just smile and never criticize when we see so many of our brothers and sisters doing the same in protest, waving the Israeli flag each and every week. But this also means that we need to focus on the beauty of Israel, the miracle of Israel, the smells, the tastes, the sounds of Israel, the messiness of Israel, the stickiness of Israel. We learned earlier this morning in our Parsha of the story of Egel HaZahav, the golden calf. And we learned that when Moshe sees Bnei Israel, the Israelites, dancing around this golden calf, Torah tells us, V'yishlach me'adav et aluchot v'yishaber otam tachat hahar, that he sends out, he throws these tablets out of his hands, and they shatter at the foot of Mount Sinai. And while we read in the text that he does so out of anger, out of frustration, Midrash suggests that the weight of the tablets of the covenant were too heavy for him to carry on his own. He was able to carry them down the mountain because he thought that he was sharing the load with all of the people of Israel. And when he saw that he was carrying that weight by himself, they became too heavy, and he dropped them and they shattered. He thought that it was a shared commitment. And so, if we say, as world Jewry, as Jewish people around the world say, that Israel is only something that matters to Israelis, then the weight of this brit that we are in is too heavy to carry on our own, and it shatters. But if we say that this is our shared brit, our shared covenant, then we carry it with us. Later in our Parsha, God commands Moses again, make two brand new tablets, just like the first, the difference being God wrote the first set, and now Moses needs to do the work, writing this second set. And you think, okay, we have the second set of tablets, we move on, we move forward. We have a new brit, a new promise heading to the promised land. But Rabbi Meir teaches in Bava Batra, in the Masechet Bava Batra, in the Babylonian Talmud, that, as we learned, the broken tablets were placed side by side in the Ark of the Covenant with the whole tablets. They were not discarded. They were not sitting in a pile somewhere waiting to be thrown into the trash. They were seen as holy and sacred. The broken tablets, the messiness, the stickiness, the complications of our breeds, of our covenants, were seen as just as important and holy as this whole set of tablets. So we can't ignore the messiness. We need to see that as just as important as those whole tablets. I've set my DVR this week for the World Baseball Classic. Those who know me know that I'm a huge baseball fan. Maybe that's an understatement. The World Baseball Classic, baseball's version of the World Cup, is where countries compete in this tournament. And in 2017, the last time it took place, Israel was the Cinderella team. It's odd because most Israelis still don't know baseball. I think at the time there was one league official field at a kibbutz in Israel. It's not like the obsession that there is with soccer or even basketball. And yet, because anybody eligible for citizenship can play on the team 6 years ago was made up of Jewish major league and minor league players. This year, there are even Israelis on the team. And when you see them lining up on the foul line, taking a kippah out of their pockets and placing it on their head, as Hatikva is piped through the speakers during the national anthems, with blue and white striped uniforms and a Magen David on their cap, it's hard to not get emotional that at a time of rising anti-Semitism, on world's largest stage, the stage of global sports tournaments, these Jewish players are proud of their Jewish identities, proud of their relationship with the Jewish homeland, with the state of Israel, representing that state. It's what Israel was supposed to be 75 years ago, that which united the Jewish people. And that's what we need to continue to do the work to make sure it remains so. So as we prepare to celebrate Israel's 75th birthday later this spring, I pray that it will be just that. At the core of Jewish texts, the core of tefillah, a relationship that is essential to Jewish community, celebrates the joy and wrestle with the stickiness. Because to refer to the statements or policies of members of this government as troublesome, well, that's a gross understatement. They're antithetical to the promises that were read when Ben-Gurion read that Declaration of Independence 75 years ago. And we can't ignore the bravery of the hundreds of thousands who protest, waving that Israeli flag, because their experiences are our experiences as a people and shape us. Let us celebrate their love and commitments for Israel through protests. Let us talk about it without fear of disagreements because of our love as well. And let us work towards building a whole set of tablets. A vision of what's the Declaration of Independence set out. A new set of tablets. A new brit. that will strengthen the relationship between the state of Israel and Jews throughout the world for the next 75 years to come. Amen.